All right, let's talk about war. So some key questions we're going to talk about in this lecture. What is war? What are the different kinds of war out there? And some key terms that you should know by the end of this lecture. Interstate versus intrastate war, tactics versus strategy, conventional and unconventional warfare, and then various types of war, including asymmetric warfare, cyber warfare, guerrilla warfare, and terrorism. Now, there's two basic philosophical approaches to the phenomenon of war. The famous strategist Karl von Clausewitz said war is the continuation of politics by other means. So on this view, there's a continuum of different tools the state might deploy, and war is just one aspect of the pursuit of your interest. Politics is simply another one. For others, war is more a symptom of a breakdown of politics. So what happens when politics fails, when negotiations, mediations, economic pressure, and diplomacy fail, then we end up in war. In other words, it's a breakdown, it's a failure. It's, in some ways, the opposite of politics. And ultimately, these can be matched up with two kind of opposed views of what politics is all about. Politics could be seen as the peaceful resolution of conflicts of interest, so the opposite of war, or politics could be seen as one symptom of the eternal struggle for power between conflicting interests in a society and between conflicting societies. In other words, politics is just a symptom of a wider phenomenon. We're not going to resolve these philosophical issues here, but it's worth keeping track of them as we progress in our discussion. So the study of the phenomenon of war is old. It's nearly as old as the written language. Some of our earliest records are records of military victories. The study of war, however, is broken down into many different disciplines and subdisciplines. All kinds of people study warfare from all kinds of perspectives. Just to give you an idea, obviously there's military studies, the study of military strategy and tactics, how to fight war. Peace and conflict studies in international relations often focus on how to avoid war. Grand strategy really talks about when and how to go to war. There's jus in bello, the morality of fighting, the morality of how to conduct yourself in war. And there's jus ad bellum, which is the justice of going to war. When is it morally permissible and even morally required to go to war? We have noted so far in this course that the state has different types of tools at its disposition to try and affect its environment and try to affect the behavior of other actors on the international stage. It's got diplomacy, which is the pitch, right? You try and change how people perceive of the worth of their different options. There is economic pressure, which is to try and bribe people to make some options more attractive or less attractive through sanctions than others. But a third tool, and one that most people think of immediately when they think about states behaving on the international scene, of course, is the threat of war, or actually going to war in order to change somebody else's behavior. Now, since the 1950s, scholars have noted a decline in the incidence of interstate warfare. There's just not as much war as there used to be, which raises the question, why is interstate warfare in decline? Lots of different possible explanations. Obviously, we can categorize these, if you like, into realist, liberal, and constructivist explanations. Realist explanations are going to focus on the changing polarity of the system. World War II marked a shift from a multipolar world into a bipolar world and marked the beginning of the Cold War. After the Cold War ended in 1991, we had a brief period of unipolarity where American hegemony contributed to keeping a lid on interstate conflict. In other words, the great powers have very little interest in sparking conflict and have a very strong interest in keeping peace, particularly on their side of the aisle, so to speak. Liberal explanations focus on different things, on the development of international organization, the institutionalization of diplomacy, you might say. So all of this proliferation of different international organizations that occurred post-World War II may have helped states negotiate with one another, better understand each other, and ultimately create a framework of rules that has helped decrease the incidence of warfare. Liberals will also look at regime change, the spread of democracy after World War II, the continuing globalization of commerce and communication and contact between peoples and cultures, all contributing to greater understanding and greater interdependence, which would lead to perhaps a more peaceful world. Finally, constructivists note that the norms of the international arena have significantly changed, particularly as the risks of mass total war have become apparent and the technological tools of destruction that we have at our fingertips are much more advanced than they used to be, that the norms have shifted. Norms, particularly against aggression. Many states simply do not see war as an appropriate means of settling interstate disputes anymore. They don't see war as normal. They see war as aberrant and morally wrong. Now, I think the changes in technology can support any of these three views. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about technology, but surely technological changes may cause changes in both the distribution of power, in how people understand their own interests, in culture, and in norms. So let's get back down to basics. What is war? How do we know if a conflict is a war? Well, there are three central features worth noting. One, war is organized. So it has to be organized and deliberate. And it's got to be conducted by some kind of authority. So a riot, a spontaneous riot, is not a war. There's conflict, there's violence, but it's not organized, it's not deliberate, and nobody's in charge. Two, violence has to occur on a sufficiently large scale. Again, if it's a small skirmish, if it's two villages going at it, it's just not clear that this counts as a war. Certainly, two gangs shooting each other up over drug territory. Just, we call it a gang war, but it's not really the kind of war that scholars of war are interested in. So you've got to have a sufficient scale, maybe 1,000 deaths per year. That's usually what is used these days. Three, both sides must have some capacity to do each other harm. So massacres aren't war. Genocide is not war. Upon observing the charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War, a French officer commented, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre." It's magnificent, but it is not war, because it was a massacre. The Light Brigade got decimated. And so war is a contest between two sides that at least have somewhat the capacity to hurt each other. Now, all of these definitions can be made more or less precise, but no matter how precise you make them, it's not going to remove the need to make some judgment calls. Is the Mexican drug war between the Mexican government and various cartels a war? Well, that is going to be something that's up to interpretations. It's got many deaths. It's definitely organized. Both sides can hurt each other. So for a lot of people, it's a war. But other people feel very uncomfortable calling something that might look more like a police action to a war, calling it a war. Right. So why does the definition matter? Why do we care what is a war and what's not a war? Well, it matters for two reasons. A liberal reason and maybe a more constructivist reason. One, there are treaties and international laws that govern the conduct of warfare and that prohibit things like genocide. So for liberals, framing a genocide as a war reduces the chance of external intervention from the international community because certain rules are not triggered by war that are triggered by genocide. Similarly, framing a riot as a war changes things quite a bit. It changes obligations due to prisoners. It also changes the rights and responsibilities to intervene of outside parties. Something that is a riot is just not an international concern. Something that is war might well be. Again, different names and different concepts trigger different kinds of rules and different kinds of behaviors on the part of the international community. On the constructivist side, how a conflict is portrayed in the media influences how international actors understand the conflict and what norms they use within their minds to morally assess the situation. And so there is a war for public opinion, you might say. Every time a conflict breaks out or violent conflict breaks out, we want to know if it's a war or not, because we want to know how to think about it and how to judge it and how to judge the behavior of different participants. So, cracking down on a drug ring does not count as aggression, right? Whereas cracking down on rebels who want an independent state, well, now that's something different. And so how we understand a conflict and whether we call it a war or not is going to influence how we think about it. Let me take a moment to talk about grand strategy and military tactics. A grand strategy is the set of moves or actions that are calculated to bring about a designed political objective. So when a statesman steps back and looks at all the tools the state has available in its arsenal and decides, okay, what's the best mix of tools that I can use to get what I want, to meet the interests and the needs of my country. So grand strategy is going to ask the big picture question. And sometimes the military will be the best tool, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes war is going to be useful. Sometimes it's a tool that's best kept in your pocket. Ideally, though, you may need a mix of tools, and so you need to coordinate those tools. The military has to behave in a way that coordinates with other kinds of diplomatic pressure, so that if the generals are doing things different than what the diplomats are saying, that can be a problem for the overall grand strategy. Everybody has to be in sync. Okay. A tactic is something much narrower. A military tactic is going to be a move or a small set of moves that is going to be calculated to bring about a kind of intermediate military objective. And that military objective is one piece of a larger grand strategy. So tactics in an ideal world should be dictated by strategy. What tactics you use depends on what your overall strategy is. Strategy is going to be concerned with the big picture. Tactics are going to be concerned with a narrower field of vision. Now, there's an age-old conflict between people in the military who would like more tactical and operational freedom to realize military objectives, and the civilian political leadership, which has to keep track of how achieving or failing to achieve these objectives and how you achieve them affects the prospects for their political objectives being realized. This is nicely encapsulated by the quote from a former French president in the late 19th century: "War is too important to be left to the generals." The notion is that if you give generals the freedom to do whatever they want during war, that can undermine various political objectives that the state has. Not every objective is worth achieving, and certainly not worth achieving in any which way. If the military has to kill far too many people or completely decimate a region in order to take control of it, and the whole point was to get the resources or the factories from that area, well, you've just undermined your strategy through the use of a successful but tactic at the tactical level, but not at the strategic level. So a good tactical plan to achieve the military objectives could ruin a sound political strategy. Perhaps these days you could say by, for instance, making world opinion against you, right? So if you use certain kinds of weapons or you use certain kinds of tactics, you might face an outcry from the world community that makes the life of your politicians more difficult, and that might make the achievement of their political objectives more difficult. Now, a smart strategy, of course, therefore, might require putting limits on the freedom of tactical operations, which are often referred to as the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement are the limits that soldiers must observe in achieving their tactical objectives. And so usually they involve things like not massacring civilians, not using nuclear weapons for this particular war. Again, the rules of engagement will specify how to take prisoners, whether or not to take prisoners, all of that stuff. What are the different kinds of war? You probably already know some of them, different kinds of war, but at the most basic level, we talk about interstate and intrastate wars. So intrastate war is a civil war. An interstate war is a war between two states. Within those two categories, interstate and intrastate wars, you have conventional and unconventional wars. Under each of these types, organizations might resort to terrorism or cyber warfare, in addition to more traditional kinds of military operations. Let me talk about conventional warfare really quickly. The key component to conventional warfare is understanding what the term convention means. A convention is an agreement, which is either a formal rule-governed agreement that's specified in a treaty, or maybe it's a tacit agreement where both sides agree to live by certain rules, but they haven't actually formed a treaty about it. But the point of the war convention is usually to limit warfare. Warfare can get pretty awful, as most of you can imagine. Certain kinds of people, that is, war could be limited to certain kinds of people, known as combatants. War could be limited to certain kinds of weapons, weapons that are capable of discriminating between different kinds of targets. Indiscriminate weapons are things like nuclear and biological and chemical weapons, which tend not to discriminate between people who are fighting and people who are not fighting. So conventions often ask people to discriminate based on the kinds of weapons that are involved. And finally, conventions can limit warfare to certain kinds of places, right? You're not going to want to have running battles in the middle of cities, for example, if you can avoid it. So you want to limit battlefields, limit warfare to certain places and avoid other places. Again, these are war conventions. Some states have adhered to them. Some states have signed those treaties, and of those states that have signed the treaties, some more or less keep to them, and others don't. But the point simply here is that these war conventions are there in place to help us figure out what kind of war we're talking about. In a conventional war, some kinds of rules apply. In an unconventional war, those rules don't apply. Now, unconventional warfare is warfare that does not conform to any established convention or agreements about the limits of warfare, either because it accepts very different limits than the convention, or just accepts no limits on the types of weapons used, the types of persons who are targeted, and the types of locations that are off-limit for warfare. Now, why does this distinction matter? Why are we worried about conventional versus unconventional warfare? Well, in part because liberals and constructivists care to try to limit the horrors of warfare, right? They want to try to make warfare safer. They don't like war, but to the extent that it has to be waged, it should be waged within limits in order to keep the violence within bounds. Now, realists are pretty skeptical that conventions are likely to do very much to limit the dangers of warfare, but it's all the better if people are fooled by conventions into limiting themselves. A realist opponent will gladly take advantage of any restriction that you impose upon yourself in order to gain an advantage. But, of course, taking advantage of those restrictions that other people put themselves under can backfire, because if you are, say, ISIS, or if you are Al-Shabaab, and your military organization uses terrorism and indiscriminate warfare to achieve its objectives, well, you're going to have a harder time finding international support, external support for your cause, and that can hurt you. And so, whether or not you should abide by the conventions of war for realists depends on a mix of costs and benefits. Now, a more common form of warfare in the 20th and 21st century is called asymmetric warfare. And this is when one side in a war has much more power than the other side, at least with respect to conventional weapons. So asymmetric warfare is fought between larger players and smaller players. So you think of the Vietnam War, you could think of the Iraq War, you could think of all kinds of modern wars, and you often see a kind of asymmetric component. Now, the two main forms of asymmetric warfare these days are terrorism and guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare consists of weaker but organized military units attempting to basically frustrate the political military objectives of the stronger units. In other words, if the stronger side doesn't win, they lose. Sometimes warfare is simply about not losing, and so if the guerrilla forces cannot be overcome, cannot be eliminated, well, they win by default, because in some cases not losing is just winning. Now, guerrillas tend to attack military and political targets. They tend to be discriminating in their targeting, and then they often retreat using terrain or civilian population as cover. So guerrilla warfare, again, typically attacks conventional targets. Terrorism is in some ways similar, but tends to be indiscriminately targeting and often targets civilians to achieve their political objectives. So terrorists are often more indiscriminate in their targeting and often are using civilian targets in order to pressure the authorities supposedly protecting those civilian targets into changing their stance. It's a form of violent blackmail. Now, terrorism, it's worth noting, has a meaning in political science and a meaning in newspapers, and it's not often the same. In political science, terrorism has to have a political objective. So a madman on a rampage is not terrorism. Somebody who just decides to go shoot up a school or a church or a mall is not a terrorist unless he or she has a political agenda and perhaps also is part of a political movement or group. It can't just be your personal political agenda. It has to be connected to a wider movement or a wider group. And terrorists in political science definition use indiscriminate methods. So an assassin is not a terrorist. Somebody who targets a specific leader or a specific general or tries to take out police commissioners and things like that, that's not technically terrorism. And of course, the line, once again, just as when we're trying to figure out whether something when we're trying to figure out whether something is at war or not, can be require some judgment calls. And of course, there are political incentives to label things label someone terrorist or label some groups terrorists rather than, well, people say freedom fighters, but rather than guerrilla fighters, right? It's worth noting that terrorism can be state-sponsored or not. Your book says that terrorism cannot be state-sponsored, and that is just not true. State-sponsored terrorism has political objectives and uses indiscriminate methods. And so states can absolutely be terrorists. Cyber warfare is somewhat hard to categorize. It's new, relatively new. It can be state-sponsored or not. It's used by both powerful states and very much less powerful actors, including non-state actors. It's often used to disrupt software and communications networks, so it's used to disrupt the capacity to fight or the capacity to make money of your opponent. Like distributed denial of service attacks, which involves overloading servers with millions and millions and millions of requests at the same time to prevent that server from accomplishing normal operations, in effect causing it to shut down. Occasionally, some kinds of software attacks can cause hardware to malfunction. The famous example of that is the Stuxnet virus developed by the United States in collaboration with Israel to try and frustrate Iranian efforts to enrich uranium in their centrifuges. Those centrifuges worked on software. That software was connected to a network. That network could be accessed from the outside, and software was reprogrammed to basically foul up the centrifuges and make them fail to produce enriched uranium sufficiently enriched to create a nuclear weapon. And so Stuxnet is a way to, so some kinds of what you might call a computer virus, right? Computer programs, but there are software programs, can cause effects in the real world. Hardware effects affect the operation of material hardware, particularly in manufacturing and in military applications. But cyber warfare, to be cyber warfare and not just plain old hacking, has to have political objectives. So not all hackers are engaged in cyber warfare. And cyber warfare to some degree can be conventional or unconventional. I mean, you think that it's unconventional because I'm not sure that there's any conventions on cyber warfare, but there might be. That is to say, just wait, there might be international conventions coming on cyber warfare. But for now, it's worth noting that some kinds of cyber warfare target military installations, while others are trying to disrupt civilian activity. And to the extent that they're disrupting civilian activity, then it looks like a kind of unconventional warfare. And that's all. I'm surprised that this lecture is this short. That's all I have for you. But if you have any questions, you know how to reach me.